I am Carrie Penman. I'm the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer for NAVEX. I have been here almost 21 years in my capacity of various roles, I guess. But I started in the ethics and compliance field about 30 years ago as the first ethics officer at Westinghouse Electric Corporation in Pittsburgh. And so really have enjoyed the field. But I have to say, one thing I enjoy the most is my relationship with my great friend and colleague, Cindy Raz. So Cindy, over to you.
Well, thank you. That's such a warm introduction. And for those of you that don't know Carrie, she is considered one of the most notable chief compliance officers in the industry. And so it's an honor to work with her every single day and a true privilege to host this session with her. As she mentioned, I am Cindy Raz. I am the Chief People Officer for NAVEX, and I had the opportunity to join NAVEX through the Legacy Ethics Point days and have since experienced a number of changes in what Ethics Point was to where NAVEX is today. And I have been beyond elated with the opportunity for growth, insights, experience, and partnerships that have formed over these several years. This particular session today is something that Carrie and I are particularly excited about, as anytime we have an opportunity to provide support to people in our respective professions with solutions and insights that they encounter every single day related to challenges in their workplace, that's a great place for us to spend time. So we are looking forward to walking through today's session with you. And on that front, I want to just give you an overview of the elements that you can expect in terms of our agenda. First, we are going to spend a great deal of time talking about why a culture matters and how you can go about minimizing risk. We'll give you some examples on signs that your culture is not thriving and what might be contributing to that from what we call a culture blocker. We will also spend amount of time on how you can build a thriving culture. It is not something that's done through a simple check the box approach. It is a consistent effort to nurture and support a culture that is relevant and meaningful to people and minimizes risk to your organization. And then as we round out our time together, we are going to speak about the critical roles that legal, compliance, and HR play together in ensuring that a culture is thriving in the capacity needed and ultimately provides a level of competitive advantage to your organization. So let's get right into the meat of our conversation here today. And before we actually dive into all of the things that we talked about, I thought it might be helpful if Carrie and I spent just a little bit of time walking through what we mean when we define culture for the purposes of our conversation today. So first and foremost, culture is going to have the basis of social norms and rules of behavior that express our belief systems about ourselves and how work is going to be accomplished. It is also how we're going to be able to relate together. The other element of culture is going to be the personal values that you might bring to the organization, and sometimes those may or may not align with the organizational values. And that can create some tensions in the workplace, which Carrie and I will talk through here in a little bit more detail. One of the things that Carrie and I have worked closely on is our annual engagement survey, and I think she'll walk through some of those details here shortly. But what you see on the right side here is called a word cloud, and it's a way that we pulse check how our culture is thriving at NAVEX, and is it relevant and meaningful to people in a manner that aligns with our core values and the goals and expectations we have for the experience of people. This particular word cloud was created based off of a question that people were asked to describe the workplace vibe from their lens. And so the larger the word that you see on that word cloud, the more often it was referenced in that space. This is a really powerful exercise to benchmark. Do these words map back to our cultural goals and the values that we hold near and dear to our organization and our team? And we have been so pleased and proud of the progress and way that we're able to measure this. And we hope that this is something that maybe could be a takeaway for you as well. Carrie, I just want to just check with you from your lens, anything that you might want to add in regards to our engagement survey and the way that we're using that today.
Absolutely. I think the first thing I would note is, and I think this is a really important note, and that is that you and I collaborate every year on the questions that are going to be on the survey. That's really important. We know that there can be tensions on who gets how many questions on a survey. And so I think it's just the fact that we collaborate and we look at how do we put out a survey that's going to bring the important points in that are important both for engagement, but also looking at the culture from the perspective of, are people willing to speak up? And so we collaborate on the questions every year. And my favorite one, frankly, that we came up with was this one that led to the word cloud, which is just give us 3 words to describe our culture. And so this really came together from the 3 words, and as Cindy noted, the larger the words, the more often it was said. So there's a few words in there that would give you pause, but overall, I think we were pretty pleased with that. And I think this is just a reminder, because we were talking about when values and culture don't align, that people do bring different values to the organization. And I just think about the number of times I've coached either my kids or mentees to really think about how their values align with the culture, and to make sure that they ask those questions, because there's just there are times when there are going to be different values, and it's a really important question to ask. So Cindy, I think that's probably all I'll say about where we are on this definition. But why does it matter?
Well, there's so many reasons, and we are certainly not going to be able to get to an exhaustive list here. But on this page, you'll get a little bit of a flavor of the things that Carrie and I have found to be very relative. First and foremost, when your culture is out of balance, your chance of risk to your organization absolutely increases. And sometimes even the phrase compliance risk can be misunderstood. It's ultimately organizational risk. And that can manifest itself in a lot of different capacities, but it will ultimately start when you see areas or pockets where trust and respect are not contiguous, or in any demonstrated capacity that you would expect in your workplace. You will start to see the quality of your products and your services decline. That can be happening across your organization, and it can also be happening in pockets of your organization. So you can have one team that's thriving and doing well, and another team's not, that is not. That's why, surveys, et cetera, by functional unit are really important to assess and understand as well. You will likely begin to see a loss of great people. Life is too short to spend an exhaustive amount of time in a place that people are not finding meaningful, or have purpose, or that they're adding value. And that is something that people more often today are comfortable stepping forward to another organization that may be more in alignment with what kind of workplace they would like to be part of. So pay attention to what's happening at your retention door. Another area that as people are leaving, I'm sure as an HR professional that may be sitting in this call, and even our compliance leaders, places like Glassdoor, Indeed, they start to bubble up all sorts of public information about your employer brand. And no different than NAVEX, we certainly have things that we don't agree with in those particular posts, but we pay attention to every single post, because there's some element of reality there for somebody that we need to understand and pay attention to. In fact, Carrie, I think last year we might have even had experience where we saw a report come through one of those mechanisms. So encourage you to pay attention to that if you're not already. Safety and well-being of people, that is a big, big bucket, whether it is protecting people from workplace violence, that is certainly very vulnerable in today's society. But there is the well-being in terms of people's emotional state. We'll talk a little bit about the growing number of cases as it relates to anxiety and depression, and how that can absolutely correlate back to an unhealthy culture as well. And then the area that our chief financial officers are going to be paying deep attention to is the trend downward in revenue. There is always going to be a cause and effect to what's happening with revenue, and culture, more often than not, can be right in the heart of that storyline. Carrie, I just want to double check anything that you might want to add in this particular point.
Yeah, I think, all you have to do is look at all of the headlines, and every day you can look at headlines about significant organizational failures or compliance failures, fines, and so on and so forth. And honestly, I'm confident about many of the organizations that I've read about. They have a code of conduct, they have policies and procedures, they have expectations against cutting corners and bypassing requirements. But culture and values can clash here, and you end up with a make plan at all costs in some of these situations. And in the end, you can have all the rules and policies and procedures in the world. If you don't have a culture that supports them, then it doesn't really matter. So I think it's really important. It's really important for leaders to talk about it, not just us in the various functional groups. It's really important for leaders to talk about it and to think about it. And I get it. For some of them, it's squishy. That's a technical term, squishy. And so it's also actually really the case with risk assessment as well. But truly, there is a reason why culture and risk assessment are the two uber factors when you look at any of the guidance documents, particularly the federal sentencing guidelines or the Department of Justice guidelines. They recognize, the government and the various regulatory agencies or the ISO standards, they recognize the importance of culture and the importance of a sound risk process to having a successful compliance program. So, it impacts behaviors across the board. And I think let's maybe take a look at the next slide to just spend a minute on that. Some of you will recognize this list. It is the list of the NAVEX 24 risk types that we use in our annual benchmark report, as well as some of our individual customer insights and reporting tools that they use. So here you may note we have 5 major categories that are listed here. There's also one called Other, which is truly the catch-all bucket. And this really is important to recognize, is that we get reports around probably every single one of these at some point in time. And our employees impact how our organizations manage these concerns on these types of issues. And they do that through the decisions that we make. So we'll talk about some of these throughout our session today, particularly around business integrity, human resources and workplace respect, and environment, health, and safety, on how they impact culture and some of the data that we have around that. So if we go to the next one, we're just going to take a second to talk about some of the signs about cultures not thriving. And I'll just kick it off. We know that there's a lot of information here. And honestly, as Cindy said on the earlier one, it's not exhaustive. There are other types of things. But here's some signs that that your culture may not be thriving. And I'll start with this first bucket, which is some of the behavioral challenges that may increase. So we may see an increase in policy violations. We may see an increase or even a decrease in the number of reports that are coming to us or to HR, legal compliance. If we're seeing changes outside of our norm, something's going on, and it's something worth testing. We see unacceptable behaviors being tolerated. That's something that I call my cynicism meter. Depending on how individuals are behaving, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a little while, but are they our top performers, but they may not be doing things the right way. Cindy talked about productivity that impacts revenue. People also may stop meeting commitments to each other. We make promises on things that we're going to get done, and people may say, I don't care. Right? And so when you start to hear a little bit of that, the other thing is the rumor mill, our dearly blessed rumor mill, that that picks up all kinds of interesting stories and conversations. And sometimes it's right, and sometimes it's picking up information because it has a lack of information that have come through in the typical channels, right? So we always say absent information, people assume the worst. And so watching the rumor mill and what's happening there. And when we start to hear that people say, I don't want to talk about our culture, I don't want to assess our culture, that certainly is a sign that we're not thriving. So Cindy, what about the next one?
Well, I just want to add on that we don't want to assess our organization or our culture. I think that is such a dangerous nuance, because the reality is that if we're not paying attention to the things that we need to hear, I mean, we all are going to be very protective of our respective culture and the things that we are striving to do. And we know that that's not always going to resonate with everybody, but we need to hear the difficult messages just as much as the great things that we're doing. So I hope all of you listening in today will embrace that and know that it will serve you best in the long term to listen to that. In terms of engagement, first, engagement can be really difficult to measure. So I want to acknowledge that. And I think there's all sorts of ways to get that, in which we won't spend time on today. But I do want to start with what is happening at your retention door. One of the things that you should not assume is that just because retention is not going up, that your culture does not have an issue. You have to kind of look at what is happening across the economy at the particular time, and understand, are people locking in and tolerating behaviors and not speaking up because they're fearful of losing a job? A lot of changes in the tech sector specifically right now, Carrie, as you've seen, that is causing people a lot of fear about security with their jobs, and that's real. And that's something that will, again, shut people down from wanting to voice their concerns. Other things, as I mentioned earlier, is that the spike of that we're seeing in relationship to anxiety and depression realities for people in the workplace, certainly in their home lives as well, is continuing to grow alongside the substantial healthcare costs associated with that. And what I mean by the healthcare costs, not just in regards to the treatment that is required, whether it's in treatment or out of treatment, but there's also the cost to the business in terms of the absences. And that is something that I would encourage you, if you're not already, to pay attention to what those trends are and take a look at that, not only by functional group that you may have, by leader, et cetera, because there's a lot that can be learned in that level of data. A couple of other things that you might begin to see is trust erosion between teams or leaders, and something that can easily happen when there's maybe a product that's not going quite the way that it should be in terms of delivery, or sales may be down, or turnovers up on a team, as you start having a bit of a blame game. And that is a great highlight to an ineffective culture, and how people are not as engaged because they're so comfortable pointing fingers across the aisle. The other area that I would just encourage people to look at in terms of that quality of work, and Carrie mentioned this a little bit earlier, that people can start to not care. And you might see them, stepping out of work earlier. You might see them doing maybe half of the level of quality that they're doing, or not taking the work project to the level that you've been accustomed to. And those are your really great performers that maybe you have been accustomed to a particular level of performance output that is now changing. And it could be for a number of reasons, whether it's their home life or the realities that might be playing out inside the workplace. Carrie, I want to turn it back over to you and talk about, when these things are happening, what risks we see from an organizational lens that start to now surface as a result of these.
Right. Cindy, we talk a lot about, the potential for, because these are people issues, we're likely to potentially see EEOC types of claims. And that includes retaliation is often filed in an EEOC claim. Other lawsuits filed against the organization, difficulty hiring, right? Cindy mentioned Glassdoor. The word gets out if organizations have a bad or a toxic culture, and that word gets out. And then one I really love to talk about as a key indicator for culture is whether or not we're having safety or quality issues, right? To Cindy's point about people not caring. Are we having more workplace accidents? Are we having more rejected product? Are we having more failed product? All of those are, in my opinion, very strong indicators of culture initiatives. And then, of course, as Cindy mentioned, some missed revenue goals. It all ties together. It becomes potentially a downward spiral if we don't catch these problems early. So let's maybe take a look at some of the data that we have to support this. And if you're familiar with our hotline benchmark report that we do every year, this is the overall mix of the risk categories that we saw and that what we are seeing in the trends. And, post-COVID 2021, we were at 50% of the cases were people-related issues, HR and workplace respect types of issues. Now in 2023, which is the end of last year, is the last data that we've collected, that jumped up to almost 55%. And noting that during COVID, we did see an increase in health and safety related concerns. Those have come down, but it's been replaced by other kind of people-related issues in terms of what we're seeing. And so, Cindy, for most organizations, this 55% of reports and feedback related to people matters, workplace respect matters. This is likely in addition to what our HR professionals are also receiving if we're not in a combined system. So this is a lot. What are your thoughts here in terms of matters that we're dealing with?
I think this rings true in terms of why it is so important that HR, legal, and compliance work so consistently and cohesively together. I think, Carrie and I, we've talked at length about the unique aspect of our partnership, and our good friend legal is not here with us, who would be giving us a hard time. Just so you all know, we can give him a hard time when he's not here. But one of the things that I hear most from him on everything that I touch is consistency, consistency, consistency. And one of the ways that we can uphold that consistency is by ensuring that we are openly sharing the information that we are receiving or experiencing. So as an example, one of the areas that I think is particularly powerful at NAVEX is through our EPIM product. We are able to intake cases both anonymously and what we call our walk-in cases. So they might come in directly to HR specifically, but the case management system is fully accessible to Carrie as our compliance officer, and to Sean Ramey as our general counsel, and to Mark Robinson, who is also our deputy compliance officer. What that kind of circle of trust, I would call it in this case, is so helpful because it offers unique expertise to each case. It helps us also position protection for the organization. As an example, if somebody reports something to me and maybe they don't like the right answer or the feedback that I gave them, they could easily go to Carrie. But because she's already aware of the case at hand, she is well equipped to manage that particular conversation. And that's an element that I would hope could be true for any organization. I think Carrie and I, we both recognize that may not be the case, but it's something that I am so hopeful. The experience that we have at NAVEX is something that all of you can aspire to have in your respective organizations as well.
Yeah, so we have some additional data on workplace discord, and some of this is also really interesting to chat about. And we pulled these particular items because they all have some aspect of workplace discord. And what I will note here first is that 18% of all of the cases that NAVEX took in on behalf of our customers last year were related to workplace civility issues. So some of these matters are really on the rise. 45% of those, as you can see here, were substantiated. And I also include health and safety in this list because this is where we have categorized all but the most imminent threats that may happen in the workplace. So this category would include threats of assault or violence. And of concern here is that 66% of those are substantiated. And then I will finally note, we do have a very, very specific category for imminent threat, which is the absolute worst of the worst nightmare you can imagine. Those, when they come in through the hotline, are substantiated at nearly 90% of the time. So we are really key in terms of receiving these types of reports, we as compliance and HR teams, to indicate where we have additional problems. Retaliation, Cindy's at the other end of the spectrum on this chart, and it's actually rarely reported. About 2% of all the reports that we receive are allegations of retaliation, and only 16% of those are substantiated. So what are your thoughts here?
I would say if we're looking at a kind of a magic ball here, that in the future, retaliation is going to creep up on this list as more systems become available to employees that they trust and have confidence will result in their voices being heard and meaningful action being taken in terms of evaluating those concerns. I also think that if you look across the headlines today, you are seeing retaliation realities that organizations are facing, and the substantial cost, not just financially, but again to their organizational brand and reputation, that is absolutely colliding at this particular time. And I think that, as the newer generation even is coming into the workplace, they are becoming more confident and comfortable voicing what matters to them or their concerns or their experience. I think at this particular point, we are still needing to build awareness for people around the confidence that they need to have to bring forward a concern. I also think sometimes, Carrie, I don't know that everybody fully understands what retaliation might even look like. And I think that's a responsibility that as practitioners, we have to educate our counterparts on what retaliation looks like in the workplace. Carrie, do you want to maybe elaborate on that?
Sure. And I think it is really important to train employees and managers what to look for. And I will tell you, back in my Westinghouse days, some of the worst retaliation I saw was peer to peer. So, be aware of that as well. I think, this 2% number on this slide, I think it gives organizations a false sense of security that we don't have a problem or potential problem with fear of retaliation or actual retaliation. If we look at data from other organizations like the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, we know that employees are saying that they either are experiencing or witnessing retaliation on a much, much more frequent basis. So, Cindy, we know this is one culture blocker. What are some others?
Well, as you'll see on this list here, there's what we would call a sample of culture blockers. And just as maybe a point of reference, I've been known to tell my children that I've got one chance to get it right as their mom, meaning I need to pay attention to the things that are happening in their world and be able to anticipate or step into an area that might even cause them to feel uncomfortable, because I want to make sure I'm not surprised by how they're feeling or doing or challenges they might be experiencing in their life that they need support with. That same kind of approach is true for an organization. I look at the role that I play at NAVEX as a fiduciary responsibility and a values responsibility to make sure we're doing the right things and removing obstacles that could otherwise impact the experience for people and the success of NAVEX as an organization. First, we've talked about that fear of retaliation at length. And the next bucket coming into this is you have to have strong leadership. If they are absent, we are going to have challenges upholding the standards that are so important for an organization to be successful for. Another area that we're seeing growing impact on is that when people don't feel a connection to the organization's purpose or feel any kind of purpose in their lives, they are unable to perform in the capacity that is needed, and they will certainly feel disengaged and then become less likely to bring forward a concern that we need to be able to understand. Other areas that we've seen happen is relationship silos. Gosh, Carrie, we've talked about the silos that can exist between compliance, HR, and legal. That's a perfect example of we need to break down those silos to make sure that they do not inhibit the conversations that are needed to ultimately support a thriving culture. So those are things that we would certainly take a look at. Some other areas would be related to assumptions and biases that creep up. Carrie talked about rumor mill. I know that can be exhausting to chase. I wish I could say that tomorrow after listening to this that you will never have another rumor to deal with, but that unfortunately is not by the nature of how humans seem to be strung right now. So what you can do is certainly establish a lot of communication clarity in that aspect, which is why inconsistent communication is a problem and obstacle within any organization that is struggling. Another area that we see creep up is unclear expectations. If people do not understand what is expected of them, both in terms of their job scope, but also the behaviors that are required for them to successfully support the cultural norms at your respective organization, they're going to be set up for failure. And that means that they cannot just have a simple one and done training thing. I've seen a lot of my own counterparts think that they've rolled out a training and that's addressed all of the concerns that they might have. And I know that all of us on this particular session will appreciate that a lot of people click through training very quickly just because it's a requirement, rather than really understanding the meat of it. So how you weave in the elements of those components is incredibly important. Workplace threats, we've talked a little bit about as well, and rounding out this list here is accountability, which is such a major bucket. And Carrie, I'm interested in knowing what data that we've got right now around accountability that might be helpful to our audience.
Absolutely. So we do an annual state of risk and compliance survey every year. And this is a data set from our 2024 survey and report that we published earlier, surveying over 1,000 compliance team members. And the one item I wanted to point everybody's attention to was the fact that only about half of the individuals who, as compliance professionals who took the survey, felt that their organization was consistent and fair in disciplinary actions as a result of matters that were raised. And so if this is true, it really has a huge impact on cynicism and certainly on our culture. And I think, Cindy, this reflects some of the tensions and perhaps some of the lack of trust or communication among our functional groups that you were talking about. Any quick thoughts on that?
I think it's just a reinforcement, Carrie, that if there is not trust and transparency across these core functions, you're not going to have a forum to even build trust, and your culture is going to be compromised. I think that it is a sad situation to know that these core functions may not be collaborating in the capacity needed. And I think it takes a very comfortable individual to know that we all have knowledge that comes to the table, but you will always be more effective when you have more minds at the table. And each person in these particular functional areas bring a level of expertise that is invaluable. And when it comes together, it is incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. So maybe I'll just make one more comment on this before we move to the next one, and that is, one thing that could be a driver of some of this lack of confidence in disciplinary actions is that some organizations do have a practice of closing cases before the actions have actually been completed. And I think that presents the risk for our organizations that whatever the remedial mitigation is, whether it was discipline, whether it was a policy change, whether it was training, that if we haven't confirmed that those actions have been taken, then it really looks like the potential for nothing happening. So, I think it's really important as well to think about monitoring for consistency. And Cindy, any quick advice for the audience on, I know this is a big topic, right? But how do you monitor for consistency and discipline? Because you could probably take an hour on this, right?
It could be its own session, and to be consistent means that you will have some tough challenges. So as an example, if you have a top performer that has violated your code of conduct, you need to be prepared to take the same exact action with that individual as you would with an underperformer or somebody that's not held in the same regard. It is when you are not consistent with your policies, your practices, and how you act in response to the violations of those is when you will get in trouble. And so I go back to my general counsel in my ear saying consistent. I don't care what you do as long as you're consistent. Well, he might care what I do, but he certainly is. Yeah, very, very much so. He is asking for consistency. So I take that lens and I look across this in everything that we do, from our pay practices to our disciplinary practices to our promotion practices to how we manage investigations. That consistency matters, and it's something that you should be hanging your hat on.
Absolutely. So on the next slide, just a little bit of additional data to share. And I want to make sure that we get through everything we want to cover today. Boy, we had so much we wanted to talk about today. But this one was really important. This actually shows by our major risk categories what actions were taken as a result of a substantiated case. That means it was investigated and it was found to be substantiated, at least all or in part, which is how we define substantiation for the purposes of this report. So I might point you to a couple of things. I think first, the black and white cases, accounting, auditing, financial fraud, misuse of assets, we are fairly consistent in taking pretty serious discipline or separation. We meaning the greater community here of doing some kind of very serious action, discipline or separation as a result of those types of violations. But I really want to point everybody's attention to the one on the left, and that is that nearly 20% of all the substantiated business integrity reports resulted in no action. These are cases that were bribery and corruption and conflict of interest and human rights and global trade and product quality and safety, all of those sitting in that bucket, and that almost 20% of them resulted in no action is frankly mind-blowing to me. Cindy, how can this be? I'm hoping this is a 2023 anomaly.
Carrie, I think it goes back to consistency matters. And when I first saw this data, I thought, please tell me there's like a drop-down box error that was checked or something that would lead to this. But that's called, turning your back on a significant risk and being unwilling to do the right thing right. In that category, I have no words, Carrie. I really don't. It's something that I hope that anybody who's on this session today will pay close attention to. But again, consistency matters, and so does acting swiftly in regards to these matters.
And if others see no action taken on these types of reports, I can only imagine what it's doing to culture. So, okay, I think we had one more on lack of accountability. And I'll just cover this real quickly, and then we'll move on to the next one. But it definitely was notable that is the smaller organizations who are least likely to separate employees and more likely to take no actions. So just some interesting data points to look at. All of this data is in our report from the Hotline Benchmark report. So feel free to grab that if you need it. All right, so one other fine point, if you will, on culture is I think we're all aware that it is not monolithic. We do not have one culture in our organizations. And it is, really important to recognize that there are subcultures, that every organization has subcultures, and they may all have different levels of organizational health. And none of these are stagnant. So Cindy, your thoughts maybe on how these can change and vary over time?
I think it depends on tensions in the organization, what the ask for output is. Sometimes when a product, as I mentioned even earlier, is not producing the results that are needed for the organization, the sales team can get perhaps tense. If our sales team is not meeting the numbers that they need to deliver upon, it could create tension with our finance organization. HR and finance can have tensions. Compliance and HR, there's so many buckets that can happen across the organization that all can tie back to a subculture nuance that you want to pay attention to. Carrie, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so I think we're going to now, we've talked about all of the challenges, potential blockers and all of that. I think, Cindy, let's maybe start taking a look at some ways to help build a thriving culture. What is most important to do?
Well, as we've talked a little bit about the importance of building trust, and the first thing is to establish a very clear and concise code of conduct with meaningful core values that people can relate to. And it's so important that when you're writing these particular materials, that they are done so in a way that is simple and easy for people to connect with. I've seen at times policies or values that are so long you lose the audience on like the first or second sentence. So would strongly encourage simplicity and meaning, with the work that is done in this regard. Alongside that, as I mentioned earlier, it is not a one and done thing when you release something out for attestation or review. That is to assume that everybody has actually read it and understands it. So that's where weaving in elements of your cultural norms and standards and policies throughout your communications, throughout the things that you're doing every year, is also going to be incredibly helpful. At NAVEX, we have a number of in-person training programs that weave in elements of our code of conduct and our core values, so that we can always come back to that as the foundation of our culture for people to identify with. Another element that is really important is to secure that leadership alignment. Carrie and I know well that sometimes that is difficult to do, because sometimes our leaders can be part of the challenge. And that's something that, as an organization, why having a reporting mechanism for people to bring forward their concerns is so important. And particularly important to have, again, the HR, legal, and compliance groups being able to have access to that information so they can work in unison to address that. Another area that I think is pretty important is when you provide people with those platforms to voice their experience, it doesn't have to be just anonymously. The cases that come through our HR team are obviously not anonymous, but I add them all to our case management system, so Carrie and our GC can see all of that activity. And that includes information regarding leaves that somebody may go on, so that they understand that if there's suddenly a performance issue coming forward, that we see that kind of connection, or if there is a report of wrongdoing and we see connections on that front, we can have it all in one place. And that can be incredibly powerful as well. Naturally, acting swiftly and consistently goes without saying, as does setting the tone. How we lead by example says more than anything in writing. So I'd encourage all of you to look for ways that you can reinforce that through your own respective actions as well. As we take a look at conflict, Carrie, I think this is a reality in any workplace. Do you want to just walk through some of those realities for people in terms of the different types of conflict that they might see?
Absolutely. And I think, we all know that not all conflict is bad. Healthy conflict is a good thing. And, we have a list of here that I won't run through, but you see a list of some examples of embracing healthy conflict, that it is important, that we have to be able to address differences of opinion in a healthy way. But I will tell a quick story, and that is back from my Westinghouse days. And when we had a new CEO come in, and it was actually the first CEO that ever came in from outside the organization. And he was real frustrated that people were just so nice to each other that they didn't challenge decisions or, thought processes in order to make it a better decision for the organization. So he said in a webinar or something that we need to have a more confrontational management style. Well, we turned into a bunch of screaming jerks. And it was fascinating because people didn't really understand what he was asking for. And I literally had to go back to him and say, I'm going to need you to clarify this, because you can't believe what's coming over our helpline. And so it really is important to get this fine line in terms of healthy versus destructive conflict. And Cindy, you had some interesting statistics on some of the costs around destructive conflict.
I do. And, it's interesting. There's a couple of reports. One is from the Society of Human Resources Management that about 100 or one third of US workers believe that workplace conflict is going to increase over the next 12 months. And that was a report that was just run this year. Another area comes from ACAS out of the United Kingdom, and it reported two very fundamental pieces. One was that an average of almost 500,000 employees resign each year due to conflict, and they equated that cost to those resignations to be more than $14.9 billion. That's just a phenomenal impact. Alongside that, you've heard me mention the importance of paying attention to leaves related to depression or anxiety. Well, this same organization found that close to 900,000 people took sickness absences due to conflict in the workplace, costing organizations more than $2 billion a year. So again, cause and effect, you will see across that aspect consistently as well. Carrie, do you want to walk through maybe a couple ways that people can be held accountable in the workplace?
Sure. We can maybe just jump to the next one. Oh, did we skip the chart? Because we lost our chart. Okay.
Just say there's a really cool chart that Carrie wants to talk about. I think it's coming up on the next one, Carrie.
Okay. I'm just so excited for that chart that I was. So just real quick on holding people accountable. And I think we've actually talked about many of these, right? Equip people for success. Some of this stuff doesn't come naturally to people, so they have to practice it. Prioritizing leadership development is really key, and acting swiftly, as Cindy noted, following through on the steps, right? If we have said we're going to be taking a certain action, then we need to do it, and we need to do it quickly. And the most important thing, which is on the next slide, which I really love, is that there aren't special rules for special people. And this is a chart that I've used for a long time, and Cindy made it even better with some really good descriptors. So I'll just note that if you look at the organization and you look at what happens to individuals and how they may be treated in the organization, this chart has values going up the left-hand side and performance going across the bottom. And so we know that the people in the upper right-hand corner, they are our top talent. And these are the ones that we absolutely praise and invest in. And then we also know those in the lower left are what Cindy called our deal breakers. And those are the ones we better be moving out real quick. And the nice people who have good values on the top left, maybe they're coachable on their performance, but it's something to keep watching. But that lower right-hand box, that is what every single employee is watching. What happens to that top performer who violates the rules? So Cindy, I'll give you a quick thought on that too.
Well, I think, Carrie, this is where the consistency comes into play, and I also think our willingness to tolerate and dismiss conduct, depending upon the caliber of the individual. From my experience, when I see employees that are tolerated for their conduct and how they treat people, there is an immeasurable impact to the organization that is not always seen in a financial spreadsheet. So I think that those are the groups that you must act on immediately and not take time to give too many second chances to, because their long-term implications are too significant. And on this front, Carrie, I know that there's a quote here that you have really valued, which is, related to performance pressures increase, so does the temptation to do the wrong thing. And we've certainly seen that, play out in a number of different realities. I think from, our lens, we have a strong belief that, again, if you don't act swiftly, that impact is only going to be greater. So pay attention to what is happening as those performance pressures are growing for your organization. Because there is going to be some things that will bubble up that you may not have anticipated in a organization that maybe is running on a little bit more stable terms. Carrie, I don't know if there's anything that you might want to add on to this before we move on to our next slide.
No, I think you covered it. All right, so I'm going to just take a minute to talk about fostering a speak up culture. And here we may be preaching to the choir a little bit, so I'll just spend a quick second on it. And that is, obviously there are things that motivate people to be willing to speak up. And that is, first, awareness of what is and what is not an issue and where to report it. And so really important that we keep, hammering that home in our conversations, in training and other places. What should you report and where should you report it? And confidence that their voice will be heard, right? That top performer isn't going to get all those special rules for special people if they violate the rules. That there's safety from retaliation and that they will be supported by their management and their coworkers. And in the next slide, Cindy, we just had a few comments on managing for retaliation. And the key thing, I think, from our perspective here is to have a strong retaliation prevention and monitoring program. Pay attention to those individuals after the investigation and the actions have been taken, after those are over. And it's not just the individual who raised the issue, but maybe individuals who participated in the investigation. So, pay particular attention to them, put in place a way to monitor, to ensure that they're not experiencing retaliation. Because if you go back to my slide on the number of reports of retaliation, they're likely to not call back and tell us they've experienced it. So reaching out to those reporters is key, and training on how the process works, also key. So Cindy, our favorite topic, the role of legal compliance in HR.
One of the things I think before we go into this office slide is that, I actually have Carrie included on our termination alias. And I do that by design because she can help cross-monitor potential retaliation that is happening in our workplace. It protects me, it protects her, and it protects our organization. And it's something that if you don't do that within your organization to have more than just HR on a termination notice, I do believe strongly it will serve you and your organization incredibly well. And this, as it comes back to, as Carrie said, we have such strong belief systems in terms of the value. You've heard this, woven in throughout our session here today as to why HR, legal, and compliance, must act together. And Carrie, I'd love to have you just walk through a few elements on this bucket from your lens.
Sure. And I will say first, obviously we have a very strong and special relationship that, I think we know is not the case for everyone who may be listening to this session. So, and, more minds coming together will always be better than one. I think we can both say we do not always agree on every matter or how to handle it, but we handle those conversations with respect and grace, and we get to that right answer. So as Cindy noted, our legal friends are missing today, but maybe there's one point on here I will call out. And that is the fact that HR and compliance roles are both exposed to some personal liability. And just another quick story. When I got promoted at Westinghouse, my husband, and some of you may have heard me tell this story, but my husband said, "Oh, congratulations, that's wonderful." And he just quietly went out and bought an updated umbrella liability policy for us at home. So, it was sort of funny, but it's also something that we keep in mind. We've got to work together and make sure that we are working well together and not creating our own messes, if you will, by not being in step. And actually, we had on the next slide just a quick a vote that we did in a webinar before, just to put maybe a punctuation mark on this, and that is that we asked webinar attendees who they most would like to have better collaboration and communication with. And 30% of those said with human resources and 14% of those said with legal. So this certainly is a desired state for all of us to be more collaborative, and it's truly a great opportunity. So Cindy, I know we had some final thoughts, and I know we're going to have a poll question that we're going to be opening up in a moment, but maybe let's start with some of our final thoughts that we hope you'll take away from this discussion today. And the first one is to be clear about your culture norms and the fact that culture should be a factor in any risk assessment that you do.
Absolutely. And another area is remember that the tone that you set for your organization about your culture begins at the very first moment that a candidate actually comes into contact with your organization. So be thoughtful around the language that's going into your job descriptions, your career page, how questions are probed in the process, the experience that candidates have at that recruiting door. It says so much about the priority of people at your organization and why it is so important to differentiate yourself at that recruitment door.
Yeah, and this next one on aligning with the company performance objectives and the strategic goals. Cindy mentioned about pressure and the pressure to perform. And if there's one thing that organizations and frankly boards of directors can also do is to look at our financial targets and say, is this reasonably achievable? Or is this going to put undue, unrealistic pressure on our employees that will tempt them to have to make a wrong decision in order to get a bonus or in order to, stay employed, right? To not have performance measures imposed on them.
And then I think, we've talked as well about the importance of our how we show up as leaders. And this isn't intended to suggest that we're perfect because we are also human. And sometimes, candidly, I think people will forget that leaders make mistakes. But how we manage those moments and how we take accountability for that moment is also important. So the tone and the tenor that we set through our actions, again, will always speak more than anything that we put into paper, and how seriously we take the culture that we believe must exist in order for our organization to be successful.
Yeah, and we can't over communicate. I think that's all that needs to be said about that. Communicate, communicate, communicate. It's really, really important.
Fully agree, Carrie. And then I hope that through all of today's content that Carrie and I have walked through, that the thing that we'll leave you most with is that culture is ultimately a strategic asset. And it's also something that requires constant nurturing. The cultural elements that you have in place today may need to evolve by, the next year. But protect it, nurture it as though it is one of your most important strategic assets to your organization because it will ultimately help your organization thrive.
Absolutely. And Cindy, while you were finishing, we had posted a quick poll question that we wanted to push to the audience. If you would like to speak to somebody about their culture or helping your culture thrive, please feel free to reach out and to check the box on this particular slide. So, Cindy, thank you so much. It's been so fun to work on this session together. Really, you're such a great partner in this journey. I'm very, very blessed to have you as a partner.
And it's right back at you, Carrie. It's an honor to work alongside you, learn from you, and just have your brilliant mind at the table. It makes such a difference into the purpose driven culture that we have at NAVEX. We're simply, it's better as a result of your contributions and that of our general counsel and our deputy compliance officer. I just want to thank everybody for taking time to join Carrie and I today. If there is assistance that we can offer as your counterparts, we would love to have a moment to spend additional time with you. So just know that you can reach out to us if you would like to connect on how we might be able to support your organization, building a culture that thrives.
Thank you, everyone.